The day I moved into the house was bright and warm, a perfect spring afternoon. The house was charming, if a bit old, with wooden floors that creaked slightly and large windows that let in plenty of light. It had a rustic charm that made me feel at home immediately, even if the wallpaper was peeling in places and the kitchen appliances looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The landlord was a middle-aged man named Mr. Greaves, who seemed polite but slightly uneasy. As he handed me the keys, he gave me a strange warning. "Don't try to open the door at the end of the upstairs hallway," he said. His tone was firm but not hostile, like he had rehearsed this line many times before. "Not?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is it a storage room?" "It's locked, and it's going to stay locked," he replied, avoiding eye contact. "There's nothing in there that concerns you." The cryptic nature of his warning only piqued my curiosity, but I didn't push. It was his house, after all, and maybe it was just a room filled with junk he didn't want anyone messing with. I nodded, thanked him, and watched as he hurried off without another word. The first few days in the house were uneventful. I unpacked my belongings, arranged the furniture, and got into a routine. The house was peaceful during the day, with sunlight streaming through the windows, and the quietness of the neighborhood was a welcome change from the bustling city I'd left behind. But at night, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things that I dismissed as my imagination. A creak here, a faint draft there. But on the third night, I heard it for the first time. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone lightly knocking on a door. I sat up, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The sound wasn't coming from the front door or the windows. It was coming from upstairs. More specifically, it was coming from the locked door at the end of the hallway. I froze, my ears straining to catch every sound. The tapping continued, steady and unnerving, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but no other sound came. Telling myself it was just the old house settling, I eventually went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Old houses made noises, I told myself. It was probably just a loose pipe or a draft. But when the tapping returned the following night, louder and more persistent, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept upstairs, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air felt colder as I approached the locked door, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Faint scratch marks on the bottom of the doorframe. They were jagged and uneven, as if something had clawed at the wood in desperation. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the door. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the doorknob. I was tempted to try it, to see if it would turn, but Mr. Greaves's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't try to open the door." Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood, hoping to hear something that would explain the noise. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, faintly, I heard it. A voice. "Let me out," he whispered, so soft it was almost inaudible. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was faint but unmistakable, and it sounded close. Too close. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions. Who, or what, was behind that door? Why had Mr. Greaves warned me not to open it? And, more importantly, how had I heard a voice in an empty house? The next morning, I called Mr. Greaves. "There's something going on with that locked room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I heard, noises and a voice. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You heard a voice?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and dread. "Yes," I said. "What's in there?" "You need to leave it alone," he said firmly. "Whatever you think you heard, just forget about it. That room stays locked. Do you understand?" "But, do you understand?" he repeated, his voice sharp. I reluctantly agreed, though his evasiveness only made me more determined to find out the truth. Something was in that room, and Mr. Greaves wasn't telling me everything. That night, the tapping returned. It was louder now, almost frantic, as though whatever was behind the door knew I was listening. And then, at exactly midnight, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then, just as I was starting to calm down, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, my heart sinking when I saw the message. It was from an unknown number. "You shouldn't be here." The screen flickered, and the message disappeared before I could respond. I sat in the darkness, the phone trembling in my hands. For the first time, I considered leaving the house altogether, but something about the locked door wouldn't let me go. It was as though the room was calling to me, daring me to uncover its secrets. I had to know what was behind that door, and I was going to find out, no matter the cost. The message on my phone haunted me for the rest of the night. "You shouldn't be here." It was a warning, or maybe a threat. Either way, I couldn't ignore it. I told myself I'd leave the house in the morning, but deep down I knew I wouldn't go anywhere. I had to know what was behind that locked door. By the time the sun rose, my fear had turned into determination. I spent the morning pacing around the house, stealing glances at the door at the end of the hallway. It seemed ordinary, harmless even, in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the memory of the voice I'd heard, or the landlord's strange warnings. I decided I needed help. I called a friend, Emily, who had a knack for unraveling mysteries, or at least a love for horror movies that made her bold in situations like this. When Emily arrived, I told her everything: the landlord's warning, the tapping, the voice, the scratch marks, and the strange message on my phone. Her eyes widened with every detail. "This sounds like the start of a horror movie," she said, half joking, "but I'll admit I'm intrigued. Let's open it." "You think I haven't tried? It's locked," I replied. "Well, locks can be picked," she said, pulling a small toolkit from her bag. "Where's the door?" I hesitated, but eventually I led her upstairs. The air grew colder as we approached the door, and I noticed Emily shiver. "Okay, that's weird," she muttered. I stayed back as she knelt in front of the door, working on the lock. She was surprisingly skilled, and within minutes there was a satisfying click. She turned to me with a triumphant grin. "Ready?" I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Slowly, Emily pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind us. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped inside, Emily close behind. The first thing I noticed was the smell, damp and metallic, like old blood. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as though the room had been holding its breath for years. The room was small and empty, with no furniture or decorations. But as the flashlight beams swept across the floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A large circle of symbols etched into the wood. They were jagged and crude, as though carved in a hurry, and they formed a pattern that made my stomach churn. "Why is this?" Emily whispered, crouching to get a closer look. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and they seemed to hum faintly, as though vibrating with some unseen energy. Emily reached out to touch one of the carvings, but I grabbed her hand. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. "We don't know what this is." She pulled her hand back, looking uneasy. "Do you think it's some kind of ritual, like witchcraft or something?" Before I could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. Emily screamed and I spun around, my flashlight flickering as I pointed it toward the door. It was closed tightly, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. "Did you close that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I said, my heart racing. I grabbed the doorknob and tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck." The flashlight flickered again, and then abruptly went out, plunging us into darkness. Emily's breathing quickened beside me, and I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. Then, from the corner of the room, came a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, a guttural growl. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Everything. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. My eyes strained against the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. And then the voice returned. "Did you open the door?" it whispered, so close that I could feel the icy breath against my ear. Emily screamed, and I turned to grab her, but before I could, something grabbed me instead. It wasn't a hand. It was cold and rough, like the bark of a tree, and it wrapped around my wrist with inhuman strength. I cried out, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened. "Let me go!" I shouted, thrashing against the unseen force. Emily was screaming too, but her voice sounded distant, as though she was being pulled away. The growling grew louder, and then the room exploded with light. It wasn't normal light. It was red and pulsating, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. In the center of the circle, something began to rise. It was a figure, impossibly tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a face that wasn't a face at all, just a void of darkness. Its presence filled the room, sucking the air from my lungs. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter as the figure stepped out of the circle, its hollow face turning toward me. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice echoing inside my head. The grip on my wrist loosened, and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. I grabbed Emily, who was sobbing, and together we scrambled for the door. To my relief, it opened this time, and we tumbled into the hallway. As we ran down the stairs, I glanced back and saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching us. Its form began to fade, dissolving into the shadows, but its presence lingered, filling the air with a suffocating dread. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air stinging our faces. The next day, I called the landlord and told him I was moving out. He didn't argue. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. I don't know what we unleashed in that room, but I can still feel its eyes on me when I'm alone. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again,